Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And if you wish to support, check out the Praise of Folly locals. I'm joined by Terminal Philosophy here today to continue our discussion on ancient warfare, specifically the second part of the Second Punic War. So, where we left off was Hannibal had just crushed the Romans in a blitzkrieg of a year and a half from 218 BC at Trebia to culminating in the greatest classical victory pretty much ever on the tactical battlefield, Cannae, in 216 BC. Now, one of the great what ifs of the Second Punic War is why didn't Hannibal march directly on Rome? In fact, in his life of Fabius, Plutarch has a little vignette where Hannibal's Numidian cavalry commander, Marhabal, says that the gods do not give all gifts to one man. Hannibal, you know how to win a victory, but not how to use it, because he says that Hannibal should march on Rome. And I think ultimately, while there's been a lot of give and take on this argument over the millennia, over whether Hannibal should have marched on Rome or not, because ultimately Rome was the head of the snake, and if you could take that out, then the Roman state would collapse. I think there are numerous reasons why Hannibal could not have marched on Rome, and it was prudent to not do so. The first one is the long walls of Rome, which went all the way down to the Ostia, where Hannibal had no siege weapons. He had no means to besiege the city of Rome. He didn't have siege towers. He didn't have catapults. He didn't have mining operations. Even at Cannae, his army was at most, depending on who you read, 50,000 men at most. Some accounts are lower, like 35 to 40,000. That's just not a large enough force to encircle the city of Rome. Second of all, Rome would have still had access to the sea, and given that Rome had naval supremacy throughout the Second Punic War, there's no way that Hannibal could have effectively blockaded the city to starve it out. So he would have had to storm the city, but of course that was likely going to be impossible. Second of all, the entire population of Rome was larger than Hannibal's army. Plus, it had, I think, 2 legions defending it. That would have completely negated all of Hannibal's advantages to either settle in for a siege or to storm Rome. It would have been a repeat of Pyrrhus sending his elephants into Argos. Not a good idea, because ultimately Hannibal's advantage was that he could effectively, in the minds of the Romans, fly over the Alps, fly over the Arno marshes. He could literally just appear almost anywhere without anybody expecting him. It was his lightning speed that gave him his advantage, and his tactical flexibility that allowed him to defeat larger Roman forces. If he had settled down for a siege of Rome, that would have all been thrown away. And given that immediately after Cannae, Rome mobilizes like 150,000 more soldiers in Italy, immediately after Cannae. So they still had vast manpower reserves, of which Hannibal knew he could not handle until he broke up the Roman alliance structure. And so he would have been pinned to the city of Rome, forfeiting his mobility and advantage that way. And they would have just, like Caesar did with Alesia, build walls of circumambulation around Hannibal and starve him out. I don't see any good outcome for Hannibal attacking Rome and besieging it. So whatever the rhetorical flourishes of Plutarch and Marhabal, I don't think that would have been a good decision for Hannibal. So Terminal Philosophy, what are your thoughts on Hannibal's march on Rome?
Right. Well, you're right to say that it's one of history's great what ifs. Yeah, as you said, just kind of as a quick recap, after the Battle of Cannae, Hannibal and the Punic position in Italy had never been stronger. And one of the aspects that made Hannibal in this era such a crafty opponent of Rome was that he was able to, he capitalized on the weakened loyalty of many of the tribes on the Italian peninsula, and that this loyalty had been shaken towards Rome. And many of the tribes and various peoples, they didn't speak Latin, and after witnessing the destruction of multiple Roman armies, they found that Hannibal and the Carthaginians were the new rising power in Italy, or at least in the Mediterranean world, as far as they were aware. And due to this, and Hannibal sending his brother further south towards Sicily and the southern portion of the Italian peninsula to persuade other cities to defect towards the Carthaginians, Hannibal was able to create a vast amount of territory under his control, or at least, strong influence in southern Italy. And that would ultimately last, this territory would ultimately last for about 15 years. And just one other quick note is that one of Hannibal's cavalry commanders, Carthallo, immediately after Cannae, just looking at things on paper, Hannibal had just completely decimated Rome's largest and best army. And so on paper, he had basically won this broader campaign. And so Carthallo, a cavalry commander, was sent to Rome to offer terms. They were peace terms. And they were something of the following: is returning Sicily and Sardinia to Punic control, pay war reparations, possibly relinquish Iberia, and then relinquishing southern Italy. And of course, Rome still had fight in it, and it still had the ability to recruit and build armies. Even if it were made up of older men and younger boys, it still had the ability to recruit and create formations rather quickly. So of course Rome didn't give into that. But onto your question with why was there no Punic assault on Rome? I think that your point about the walls that surrounded Rome and all the way down to the sea is a great point. Hannibal's force was not large enough to besiege Rome for any lengthy amount of time. Also, where he was at just after Cannae, it's something like 400 kilometers between Cannae and Rome. That's an incredibly long march, filled with, that's just a very vulnerable route. Anything could happen between Cannae and Rome. And Rome was also receiving supplies regularly from Sardinia and Corsica. So ultimately, I do believe it was a strategically good idea to not assault Rome. It would have been that, Hannibal is, of course, one of history's greatest and craftiest risk takers, but that would have just been simply too much. It just appears to have been better. Yes, that if he was successful, that would have probably ended Roman hegemony for who knows what amount of time. That would have changed history completely, likely. So it was better for the Punic strategic position in the campaign to at least, garner and build up support for the Punic cause in southern Italy, and to disrupt these various alliances that Rome had with its these tribes that it had fought, a century earlier. So that was kind of the position that Hannibal was in. And also, to kind of finish up on my first comments as well, is that Hannibal, despite winning a lot of support from Carthage, he got limited supplies and financial help from Carthage itself. And so again, you can still tell that there's this divide between the Barcas and the remainder of the Carthaginian political establishment. And that's sort of a whole other subject unto itself, apart from the military campaign analysis. But that is sort of the general panoramic overview of why Hannibal likely did not assault Rome.
Right. Now, briefly, I'll sketch out the broader strategic outlook in Italy up until 211, and then focus in on some of the insightful battles that are useful for explaining various tactical formations and hinge battles in this campaign. So immediately after the Battle of Cannae, Capua basically defects to Carthage, which is the second largest city in Italy. Capua uses the casus belli of, we want to have a guaranteed consul selected from Capua, and Rome's like, that's not going to happen. And so that's Capua's excuse to defect, which is a huge loss because Campania was the sort of breadbasket of Italy at the time. And in fact, if we go back to the First Samnite War, that was one of the impetuses that the Romans violated the Liris River Treaty to go further south, because they thought, well, if the Samnites get that breadbasket, they might be able to starve us. So this is a huge windfall for Hannibal. He's able to supply his troops with food. The provinces of Lucania and Bruttium, also, basically, if you look at Italy as a foot, you'd be like the ankle and the the ankle and the toe would be what joined Hannibal. Now, the benefit is he can raise Italian troops and Greek troops, but the downside is he has to now defend these against the Romans. And he doesn't really have enough manpower to defend all of these. He's also interested in the heel of Italy, Apulia, because if he can take Apulia, he can then get have beachheads for direct allied landings from Macedonia. And he can then unify Magna Graecia against the Romans. Now, what we see then is that the Romans are desperate, and so they raise vast sums of men. They get rid of the property requirements, the age requirements. They recruit slaves. They recruit criminals. By 212 BC, the Romans have 100,000 Latin and then allied soldiers. Vast 200,000 allied total forces in the field in Italy alone to contain Hannibal's 40,000 men. Needless to say, these sort of large-scale direct conflicts like Trebia, Trasimene, and Cannae are forfeited for throughout the rest of the Italian campaign, with a handful of examples we'll get to later. They do not fight. The Romans do not fight Hannibal in anything like a classic-style conventional battle that we see. And there tends to be two leading figures in this. There's the more passive and shadowing force and then the more active force of Martellus. Martellus is the aggressive. He still pursues the Fabian strategies of Fabius, but he also will be willing to attack Hannibal under favorable circumstances, like small detachments and whatnot. And he does score some interesting minor victories against Hannibal to buoy Roman morale. Now, right after Cannae, the Romans send an army to subjugate the Boii tribe in Cisalpine Gaul, led by Lucius Postumius. And in a battle that prefigures the defeat in the Teutoburg Forest 220 years later, a column of legions gets ambushed where, according to Polybius, the Gauls had cut the trees such that as you marched down the road, you couldn't tell that they had been cut and they still stood up straight. But if you just slightly push them, they'd all fall down. So you have this like Roman column marching through, and all these trees just fall on them, crushing men alive, and then cutting them off. And then they're surrounded by the Gauls and destroyed. So 5 legions are wiped out in an ambush by the Gauls. And for most of the rest of the campaign, the war even, they don't send troops to fight the Gauls. It was a catastrophic defeat. And in many ways, it was a tactical use that we see prefiguring what we'll later see with Arminius in the Teutoburg Forest. Now, Marcellus, who we already mentioned, scores one of the first clear victories against Hannibal. It's a minor victory, but it's the city of Nola. So Nola is a city in, I think it was Capua, or the Campania, rather. And he and Hannibal were marching to get there first. Now, he beat Hannibal to the march and took over the city. But he had caught wind that Hannibal was conspiring with elements on the inside and decided to allow Hannibal to think that his plot had succeeded. So the initial battle was a brief skirmish outside of the gates, which was relatively inconclusive, in part because Hannibal's troops it started engaging in skirmishing tactics like we saw at Trebia, and then as it was evolving into a larger battle, Hannibal called off the attack because he wants to be in control of the how, the when, the why, and the where. And if it develops outside of that, he wants to pull it back immediately to start over. And when Martellus figures out about this conspiracy, he sends his own legions, disperses them throughout the city, takes them off the walls, in order to do 2 things: to deceive the Carthaginians into thinking that they've abandoned the defense of the walls, but also to keep eye on potentially disloyal Latin and Greek forces within Nola. And when Hannibal attacks again, he sends his troops out of the front gate, a portion of his army. When Hannibal attacks, it's largely, inconclusive. And then as the Numidian cavalry begin to threaten the Roman flanks, another army, the other army that was kept in reserve, marches out of the gates, scattering the Numidian horse. And Hannibal, realizing that his plot had failed and that Martellus was gaining the upper hand, withdrew. So this was the first clear-cut Roman victory against Hannibal. It was a minor victory, but after the string of defeats, it was one that the Romans desperately needed. We also see that in 214, Tiberius Temporius Gracchus was attacked an army by Hanno, who had been raising local Greek troops in Magna Graecia to help aid Hannibal. And at this point, the Romans are desperate that he promised freedom to the slaves if they should defeat the Carthaginian forces. And what we see in at this battle at Beneventum, as a common theme, if the Carthaginians do not use sophisticated shock and awe tactics like Hannibal did at Trebia or Trasimene, or sophisticated maneuver operations, and it becomes a general line of battle slugfest, the Romans will win. The Romans have more determination, more stamina. The Carthaginian advantage lies in the fact that it's made up of many different composite pieces that can work like a Swiss Army knife. And if you use each of them the way they're meant to be used in this suite of tactics and feints and stratagems, you're more than a match for the Romans. But it takes a certain kind of leadership style that Hannibal had, arguably some of his siblings like Hasdrubal had. But in the long run, many of the Carthaginian generals did not have. And in a general slugfest, the Romans are going to win. And this was a huge setback for Hannibal because these 18,000 troops were desperately needed for the Carthaginian forces. And of course, the Numidian horse were superior as always, but when the main line of battle collapsed, they dispersed. And so Hannibal was forced to give up Campania. And one of the reasons why Campania is fought over so much is because of Capua, of Nola, and of its grain sources. So, terminal philosophy, what are some of your thoughts?
Right. Well, it's true to say that the loss of Capua created panic in the Roman Senate, and not only because of this sort of rich agricultural area that it was a part of, but it also created a bit more of a clear-cut route towards Rome should Hannibal decide to assault Rome. And it just further underscored these weakened alliances that Rome had with its various tribes throughout the Italian peninsula. And as you also mentioned, up north, as a way of punishing the Gallic tribes in helping Hannibal pierce deep into Italy, Rome sent an army north to punish these tribes, and that was under the Roman general. I forget his full name, but his last name is Albinus. And just as you said, in sort of a column formation in this heavily wooded area, the Gallic tribes cut down these trees, sent them down towards the Roman legions and had them surrounded. And something like over 10,000 men were killed, and there was there's a report of like only 10 survivors. So the entire army was effectively annihilated, with Rome sustaining yet another horrible loss even after Cannae. Now, it's also true to say, one of the more important events to cover, even though it was a minor victory on the part of the Romans, as you said, was the Battle of Nola. And that was just a bit the reason why, as you detailed fairly well, was that the reason why Nola was a minor Roman victory was because of sort of Marcellus's ability to pick up that there was, pro-Punic elements within the city. And, there was obviously as a heavy anti-Roman sentiment throughout the city. So he deceived the Carthaginian attackers by, as you said, taking the legions off the walls, making Hannibal think that the city was vulnerable to attack. And so, yes, while it was a minor victory and it wasn't a huge loss for Hannibal, but that was sort of the first victory that Rome could claim, and that helped their cause throughout the general region to further solidify Roman hegemony. I think, and then trying to think here. Oh, and then, there's also the bit of where, an alliance was formed by Philip V of Macedon. And I don't know if you want to say anything about that, but that was another alliance that was formed that took about over a year to negotiate. But the Philip V of Macedon noticed that, Hannibal was obviously the new hegemon on the block, and so he wanted to take advantage of this politically by forming an alliance with the Carthaginians.
Yes. So for the rest of the Italian campaign up to year 211, we see that Hannibal scores two crucial victories in 212, illustrating the fact that he's still the best commander in the world at the time, and that the Romans cannot underestimate him. So he is trying to consolidate his control of Apulia, which again is what we might call the heel of Italy. And he's taking the city of Tarentum. Now, the Tarentines are a Greek city, and those are the people that invited Pyrrhus to go fight the Romans in Magna Graecia. So these are people that don't like the Romans very much. And they were able to invite Hannibal in at secret at night to attack and ambush the Roman garrison. They waited till there was a feast, and the Romans were drinking and feasting and having a good time. And then Hannibal is let in at night under pretenses, and then kills the Romans and takes over the city. And the Romans are just completely kicked out of that area. But that's also balanced out by the Second Battle of Beneventum, where Bomilcar is defeated by Quintus Flavius Flaccus. Now, in 212, we have the Battle of Solaris and the First Battle of Herdonia. The basic idea here is that Hannibal uses the classic strategy we'll see later with Napoleon, where you interpose yourself between two armies and destroy each one in detail before they can combine together to outnumber you. So in the first case, at the Battle of Capua, the Romans are besieging Capua, rather, with 8 legions led by Appius Claudius and Quintus Flavius Flaccus. So Hannibal sends his forces out to harass and chase them around. In order to lift the siege, he actually sends troops to threaten Rome directly in order to pull these troops back away from Capua. And these armies split up at this point. So Flaccus marches to Cumae and Pulcher to Lucania. And what happens at the first battle of Herdonia, we see that Hannibal attacks Flaccus's forces, and in a kind of double envelopment, annihilates them. So this is sort of a repeat of Cannae, but on a smaller scale. And we see there's not much written on these campaigns by Livy or even Plutarch, or not Plutarch, Polybius. I guess because they think that these Italian escapades of Hannibal in the middle of the war are not as important as the rest. But basically, Flaccus's forces and Claudius' forces are separated and then are destroyed in detail individually. When we get to Spain, we'll see that this was a mistake, that the Scipio brothers ignored this lesson. And they ought to have been able to learn from it, because it happened a year before their disaster in the Battle of the Upper Beatus, which we will get to. But at the end of this period of 211, the Romans finally take Capua. And part of this is the overall Roman grand strategy of pressuring Hannibal all across Magna Graecia. And there's no way that Hannibal's small army can defend all of these locations at once. And once the Romans really dig in a entrenched position, Hannibal's just not able to attack them and dig them out. Because again, mobility and striking power is his strength. Now, this does begin to indicate that, at least within Italy, the tide may be turning in favor of the Romans. But as we'll get to a little bit later, events in Spain threaten to undo all of this. So what are your thoughts on the rest of this Italian campaign?
Right. Well, as you mentioned, I mean, the main sources for this this time period are obviously Polybius and a bit from Livy, and this is a bit of a more arbitrary part of the campaign where there's just not any major pitched battles, but you do see further solidification of Carthaginian influence in southern Italy, especially in Bruttium or Bruti and Lucani and Tarentum. It's true to say that Tarentum has had a long history of sort of resentment towards Romans because of their history of inviting Pyrrhus to come in and fight both the Romans and the earlier Carthaginians. So they've always been there's always been sort of a political spirit of independence there. However, they were never able to create the type of Greek city-state independence like Athens or Thebes or Sparta or something like that. They were just too they're always under the Roman hegemony to create any sort of independent territory or influence for themselves. And so yeah, this period is just a bit less dramatic and less epic, as they say. But as you mentioned, kind of one of the more interesting turning points is or maybe not a turning point, but one of the more points of interest is the Battle of Capua in 212 BC. And of course, that is a Carthaginian victory. The losses on both sides aren't particularly well known, but something like 1,500 to 2,000 Romans were lost, and there's a bit of there's no way to know how many troops were lost by the Carthaginians. But either way, Quintus Fulvius Flaccus and the Appius Claudius Pulcher, they were the two commanders in charge. And so far, you can kind of see this. There is sort of an internal contradiction within the Roman strategy of not sure, there's sort of this indecisiveness about how to fight Hannibal, whether it's going to be in direct pitch battle or more of the Fabian strategy of just sort of, harassing and following and undermining the logistics of Hannibal.
Exactly. Now, at the Spanish theater at this time, we have the first major battle since the Battle of the Ebro River in 217 BC, in 215 at the Battle of Dertosa. So the first thing that the case here is, unlike in Italy, the Gallic forces here are anti-Carthaginian and pro-Roman, or at least sympathetic to the Romans. So the Scipio brothers are beginning to court and woo Celtiberian forces south of the Ebro. Hasdrubal sends his own forces to suppress Celtiberian uprisings, specifically the Turadani tribe, leaving Hamilco and New Carthage. And so there ends up being this sort of chess game for the loyalty of Celtiberian villages and cities. And the Scipio brothers decide that it's time to cross the river and threaten the Carthaginians in Spain directly. And Hasdrubal follows them. And there's this bit of maneuvering, trying to get a superior position, where it finally sets up at the Battle of Dertosa. But both sides have roughly 20 to 25,000 troops. The Romans have 4 legions, 2 Roman, 2 allied. And with their classic formation of the infantry in the center and the Roman cavalry on the wings. What Hasdrubal has is he has on his wings elephants and then cavalry. He's attempting to replicate Hannibal's success at Cannae. So then he has the heavy infantry of the Africans to the furthest right and left of the infantry main line, with the Celts in the middle. And he's hoping to have this, concave trap where the Romans push in and then are surrounded and decimated. But what Hasdrubal doesn't count on is the loyalty of the Spanish troops. So while on the wings, the Romans are somehow able to deal with the elephants. Livy and Polybius don't really tell us how. Presumably, it wasn't a very good idea to mix your own elephants and cavalry up together. That might be partly why it didn't work out. But the Numidians were successful, as usual, in defeating the Roman doubles. And as the Romans pushed in the center, the Gallic forces broke and ran because they were not loyal to the Carthaginians. They did not feel like that they ought to die for the Carthaginians. And so the entire Roman center, the Carthaginian center, disintegrates. And then the Romans are able to encircle the African forces. When the Numidians see this, they withdraw because they're faster than the Roman foot. And the Africans are cut down to a man. And it's a complete catastrophe for the Carthaginians. They're unable to support Hannibal. They're not able to march over the Alps. Hasdrubal will eventually do so, but that will be 6 years later. Far too late to have an effect on the war. But we also see that the position of the Scipio brothers is not markedly improved, because for the next 4 years, they don't do anything. I think in part it's because Spain is a backwater, and with all the disasters happening in Italy, they just can't get the resources they need to deliver a knockout blow to Carthage. And furthermore, You mentioned also Hanno and the Senate in Carthage not supporting Hannibal. Well, the Carthaginians in Spain were getting a lot of support. Hanno was more than willing to redirect Carthaginian resources to Spain. And one could argue that was because he wanted to hamstring Hannibal, which is true. But also, given the string of defeats, Sissa in 218 BC, the Battle of the Ebro River in 217 BC, and Dertosa in 215 BC, Spain wasn't doing so well. Like, Spain really did need to be supported by Carthaginian resources because that's where they got all their gold and silver from to pay their mercenaries. So it's not like you could just, lose Spain. And as we'll see in the next episode, Scipio Africanus knows this, and this is why he plants his knockout blow in Spain. But for reasons that are not entirely clear to me, the Scipio brothers just throw all caution and reason to the wind. And in 211, or rather in 212 BC, they cross the Ebro, marching deep into Carthaginian Spain, into the upper Beatus River, which is modern-day Portugal. And there's two mistakes that they make immediately. First is, and these are just basic military strategy 101, they did not have secure lines of communication. From the Ebro to the upper Beatus is a distance crisscrossed by Carthaginians and Gaelic tribes that they had not fully pacified. And second of all, when they realized that Mago Barca and Hasdrubal were separated, they separated their own armies, rather than what Hannibal did at Silius and First Herdonia, keeping his army intact and defeating each Roman in detail. So this is just a textbook disaster waiting to happen. So they capture the mining towns of Castulo and Saguntum. And then they add 20,000 Celtiberians join their forces. So now it's a total of 30,000 Roman and allied forces with 20,000 Celtic forces. So that's 50,000. But the Celts are notoriously fickle and unreliable. And so when they see that when they see that Mago and Hasdrubal's forces are divided, they themselves divide. So Hasdrubal is located near Amtorgis, and then further west in the Beatus River basin, we have Mago Barca and Hasdrubal Gisco. So then Publius Scipio engages Mago Barca, and Gnaeus Scipio engages Hasdrubal. Now, the forces of Mago Barca are reinforced by the Celtiberian chieftains Indibulus and Medonius. And at the Battle of Castulo, Publius Scipio is harassed by Numidian horse, and the battle lasts into the night. But what ends up happening is the Gaelic forces come right before dusk and tip the battle in favor of the Carthaginian forces, completely destroying the Publius Scipio's forces. And Gnaeus Scipio has no idea that his brother and his entire army has been defeated. And so he's attacking the Carthaginian camp led by Hasdrubal. And Hasdrubal's in a strong defensive position and feels no need to move. So the Romans set up siege preparations. And then they realize that, there's this huge other Carthaginian army coming. So they withdraw to a hill for the defense, but they're completely surrounded and destroyed. And this is a complete catastrophe. This defeat undoes everything that the Romans had achieved since 218 BC. And they run the risk of losing their little foothold in northeastern Spain. One of the complaints by later historians is that why didn't Hasdrubal and Mago aggressively push to drive the Romans out? They were immediately reinforced by sea by a certain Nero, who brought his own troops with him as well. Well, I think one of the reasons why they didn't do that is because the Romans had already beaten them multiple times up in that corner of Spain, which was very far from the logistical base of Carthage. Not having naval superiority, they couldn't send supplies by sea, but had to go by land from New Carthage. Second of all, going back to the First Punic War, the consequences for defeat were crucifixion in Carthage. So if you have that sort of Damocles hanging over your head, how many risks are you willing to take? Now, Hannibal was willing to take risks, but he could win. Hasdrubal, most likely, was still smarting from his defeat at Dertosa, where he tried to use imaginative tactics, but they failed due to unreliable Gaelic forces. And the Gauls that helped tip the scale against Gnaeus Publius Scipio could just as easily switch sides as they had at Etosa. So Celtiberian disloyalty within its own ranks, potential Celtiberian uprisings at home, memories of Roman victories earlier in the campaign, and fear of crucifixion all probably conspired to curb the expectations of Hasdrubal in exploiting this victory. But nonetheless, it was a catastrophic defeat for the Romans, setting everything back to essentially 218 BC.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And, it's really strange that, normally the Scipio brothers are known for, an artful campaigning style. However, because they pierced too deep to the south across the Ebro and didn't secure lines of communication, I mean, that just opened up all sorts of vulnerabilities. Another point of interest in terms of broader Iberia or, Carthaginian Spain is that there were, a vast collection of different tribes and clans that, had sort of loose alliances with each other. And, and they had sort of various, waxing and waning sort of loyalties towards Carthage. And one thing that Carthage had done years earlier was that they had kidnapped or abducted the children of various tribesmen leaders to sort of, hold them at ransom or kind of, hold them as a way of maintaining, some level of consistent loyalty towards Carthage. So that had also created a bit of resentment on the part of the tribesmen towards Carthage. And, another point about sort of the Hanno versus Hannibal problems politically within Carthage is that you're right, due to the size of the front in Iberia, that simply required a bit more logistics and time and attention for Carthage in order to maintain either defensive posture against the Scipio brothers, potential advancements towards the south, or and also kind of maintaining the various loyalties of these various tribes in Spain. And also, yes, you were right to point out that this was sort of the main source of all of the gold and silver mines towards to bankroll the war efforts on the part of Carthage to pay these various mercenary armies and these mercenary elements from North Africa and Iberia and former territories of Sardinia and Corsica. But as you mentioned, due to this defeat that the Scipio brothers had sustained, this set them back kind of to almost like a reset by near Hibera and just that along that southern coast where they had basically had to not necessarily start from scratch because I don't know that the entire army was annihilated, so to speak, but it was complete. It took them completely out of any sort of strategic offensive initiative. So that's kind of another what if. Like, what if the Scipio brothers didn't actually advance as far south as they did? I think, but otherwise, you have a good summary there. Up to this point, yeah.
Now, going back in time a little bit to 216 BC, Sardinia and Sicily revolt against the Romans after the crushing defeat at Cannae. So what we see is that the Roman commander of Sardinia, Tiberius Sempronius Longus, was himself already sick. A Punic Sardinian landowner, Hampsicora, led a revolt along with his son Hyastus. And the Romans, asked for more support from the home country. And of course, that took a while to materialize. So the Carthaginians tried to send support to Hampsorca, but a storm off the Balearic Islands blew it off course. So in order to marshal support and thinking the Romans would be unwilling to act with a sick commander, he divides his forces, sending half into the interior to galvanize support and leaving his son with the other half to defend the city of Cornus. Now, a Roman relief force does come, led by Titus Manlius Torquatus, and with his relief force and the original garrison, he has 20,000 foot and 1,200 horse. So he marches to Cornus in order to engage and at least destroy or wound in part Hampsichorus, his son's army under Hyostus. Because the argument is if they were to combine their forces, they would be so great that they would overwhelm the Romans in a single battle. And it's not so much that Torquatus thought that he could outright defeat Hostius and take the city, but more that he could inflict severe losses on him so that the next campaigning season, the difference between the rebels and the Roman forces would be narrow enough to ensure victory. And initially, Hostius was in a strong position, anchoring his flanks by the seacoast in a mountain range in front of the city. But the Roman was able to provoke him with personal insults to attack in the general conventional style. And as we've seen, and we'll see again, the Romans excel at this. They're the guys that can keep on landing punches and blows again and again and again, and eventually break the enemy. So if you fight them on their terms, they will grind you down into dust. You have to outwit them, outmaneuver them. And, very few people very few generals in this campaign are able to do this. But then you have, in the fall of 215, Hasdrubal the Bald, who lands an army at Theros and arrives to fight the Romans at Calaris. And near Calaris, they meet at Deacon Amanu. And again, it's a general conventional battle where the Romans are eventually victorious. The Carthaginians sail to sea with 60 quinqueremes with the remnants of the troops, but are ambushed by 100 Roman quinqueremes and destroyed. So, and those that get away are destroyed in a storm. So all the resources that Carthage invested in the Sardinian campaign were destroyed. It was a minor disaster for them. But in light of Hannibal's victory in Italy, that was not as readily observable. And in fact, the defeat at Dertosa was probably more serious than this. In 215, Hero II, longtime ally of Rome from the First Punic War, dies. His son Hieronymus takes over and decides to reassert Syracusan hegemony in Sicily by allying with Hannibal and the Carthaginians. This is where we have Archimedes, the famous Greek geometer, and all of his inventions on the walls of Syracuse to defeat the Romans. And the Roman siege force is led by none other than Marcellus, the dogged Roman commander who scored a victory against Hannibal. So the interesting elements of this siege are, one, Roman determination. The Romans are just in it for the long haul. Most prior sieges of Syracuse, either by the Athenians or the Carthaginians, were not properly constituted to be this long-haul siege, and they ended up either breaking up due to relief attacks or disease. Whereas the Romans, they control the sea, they control the land. It's a waiting game, and they're just going to wait. Now, initial attacks by land and sea are repelled by the machines invented by Archimedes: ballistas, onagers, a giant crane arm that can grab a ship and then dash it to pieces along the side of the city walls or the sea coast. Also, there's the imaginative sun laser towers that he built, which is still an open question if he really harnessed the sun to burn Roman ships. But regardless, he caused a lot of headaches for the Romans. And so Hamilcar also took the city of Agrigentum, which was an early Roman victory in the First Punic War. But ultimately, Marcellus is able to take advantage of a festival to Artemis, finding a weak spot on the wall to attack at night, getting a beachhead into the city, and then overrunning it. Even though he gives a command not to kill Archimedes, one of the frustrated Roman soldiers cuts him down where he stands. So by 212 BC, the islands, if we will, the disputed island areas of Sardinia and Sicily, are firmly under Roman control. So as we recap, by 211, the Romans have suffered a complete catastrophe in Spain, undoing all of their victories they had achieved up to that point. Really, this was Rome's to lose, because up to that point, Rome had an unbroken string of victories against the Carthaginians. Only the insanely reckless move of the Scipio brothers allowed this to happen. A more conservative march down the coast, flanked by the Roman fleet, would have probably yielded more lasting and durable success without risking the entire army in that region. They had also reclaimed Sicily and Sardinia, which would be important for staging grounds for the eventual invasion of Africa, and had retaken Capua. So, looking at the geopolitical picture here for Rome, things are beginning to look a little bit better in Italy, and but terribly worse in Spain. And Rome is still technically losing this conflict. They have lost far more troops than Carthage has. I think by this point they've probably lost close to 300,000 soldiers. And they lost 150,000 of those soldiers in the first 2 years of the war against Hannibal. So what we can see at this point, though, is one, Rome has vast resources, financial, political, manpower that no ancient civilization that could have produced. And they had this tenacious, never give up mentality that Hannibal and before him Pyrrhus failed to take into account. Any other ancient political state would have faltered by that point. We see with the legions of the Persians, they were no match for Alexander's brilliant maneuver campaigns. It also helped that he had a siege train to take all these fortified cities, which Hannibal did not have. And so we also see that when we get to Scipio Africanus, the Roman Republican system, as Machiavelli points out in the Discourse on Livy, gives them the opportunity to find the right man for the job. It has this pool of specialists and elites that can be called upon with a diverse set of skills, whereas an autocracy like Persia, you've only got the king and his nobles, and if none of them are up to the task, then they're not up to the task, and then they lose. The Romans were slow learners. They had to suffer horrendous losses early on, but eventually with the likes of Fabius and Marcellus and finally Scipio Africanus, they're able to find men who are able to learn from Hannibal and then turn the tables on Carthage.
Right. Yeah. I mean, just as you said, no other ancient civilization could have sustained losses like Rome had, but, due to Rome's resourcefulness and its general political and social and logistical system, it was able to survive. And I mean, they had to suffer horrendous losses, not only just in manpower, but in, huge financial losses as well. There's also other sort of like interesting things on the periphery, like with the death of a leader of Syracuse, Hieron II. It was his grandson, which was, I think it was like Hieronymus or Hieronymus, however it's pronounced, who noticed the Punic hegemony of southern Italy. And so he sort of sent, negotiation, or not necessarily negotiations, but basically seeking advice from Hannibal as how to divide up Sicily to undermine Rome in general. And, we also see throughout, this from 218 to 211 losses in Sardinia, on the western coast of Sardinia as well, cutting into Rome's agricultural production and obviously not ending it, but cutting into the city of Rome's agricultural direct supply line. So, I mean, this is definitely, I mean, on paper, again, you look at these losses and the loss of territory, especially the battle of the Upper Baetis or Batis, with both Scipio brothers, and just obviously, unfortunately, suffering a tactical blunder of just maneuvering too far south. Well, they basically have to rebuild their armies, and again, the losses in that battle were like 20 to 22,000 alone. And so, I mean, this is just like it just flabbergasting that Rome can come back from this time and time again. But Rome's also willing to field like young boys as young as 16 and older men, men who are typically reserved for like a city, like an internal city garrison, and they'll train and forcefully conscript any citizen if they have to, if the situation is desperate enough. And you can also notice this Carthaginian, the political and logistical stresses of maintaining a presence in southern Italy and, a standing army with Hannibal, but also managing the situation in Spain and dealing with its own internal contradictions within the Carthaginian political system and these various allegiances towards either Hannibal or Hanno. And so, I mean, I guess what you're just seeing is just the Roman ability to survive and just hang on and learn from their mistakes And eventually we'll see in the following episodes that Rome was able eventually to overtake Hannibal. But again, it just required, for Rome, I guess they had to sustain huge losses and also a huge hit to their coffers as well.
One thing to point out is what might have tempted the Scipio brothers on such a bold move is to attack Carthaginian mining operations directly to then cripple the war effort, a kind of high risk, high reward operation, which they completely bungled. But that's one possible justification for such a unprecedented, bold strike. But I think what I'll end with is the three things that we see here is that one, the holding of northeastern Spain to prevent Hasdrubal from marching reinforcements to Hannibal is again one of the key elements of this whole war. If Hannibal had been reinforced earlier, there are doubts if the Romans could have even been victorious. Even as late as 207, Livy and Polybius report the Romans were afraid that if Hannibal and Hasdrubal joined forces, they would win the war, even that late of 207. So one can only imagine if it happened earlier, it would have been over for the Romans. So the genius of Publius Scipio to send troops to northeastern Spain and hold that bottleneck was crucial. And this is crucial because Rome has naval dominance. If Carthage had controlled the seas like it did in the last war with Rome, they could have sent troops directly to Italy and supported Hannibal directly. And then thirdly, Rome had a unified political base where everybody was on the same page, beat Hannibal. Carthage did not. In fact, because the Barcids had their own independent power base in Spain, increasingly modeled off the Syracusan Greek dictatorships, there was a gap between them and the Carthaginian government based on more classical republican forms of government. So there was a lack of unity here based on class interest, based on policy interest. And Hanno, who you could argue is just trying to hamstring Hannibal, he can always make a plausible account about why Hannibal doesn't need the resources. He said to Mago right after Cannae, well, if Hannibal's already won, he doesn't need our help. And if he needs our help, he hasn't already won. It's a very rhetorically slimy thing to say, but it worked. And every time he redirected troops to Spain after each disaster, that's a very plausible thing to say. I mean, you can't lose Spain. You can't lose the gold and silver. You can't lose the Celtic Iberian soldiers. And so he was a very savvy politician. But again, the lack of political unity, Hannibal's always fighting with one hand tied behind his back. And I think all of those big strategic issues play into the ultimate Roman victory.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect summary of at this stage in the war. Rome was always able to, present some kind of united political front against Hannibal, whereas Hannibal, I mean, even before Hannibal's successes and, he crossed the Alps, I mean, there was already these internal political contradictions and conflicts within Carthage itself. And Carthage just didn't have as of a dynamic political system that Rome did. Even though Rome sometimes did a poor job of maintaining its alliances with its various neighbors. And, obviously it took a long time to establish, an alliance with, or, create sort of a better alliance with Tarentum and Capua. The system itself was able to maintain its own political legitimacy, raise armies, wisely spend money on where it had to. And there was, vast, Rome had also, taken note of the Carthaginian, sea logistics and was always receiving agricultural and supplies from places like Corsica and Sardinia and Sicily. And with all of this, material advantage that Rome enjoyed, despite all of these severe losses, it's just, it's not a horrible comparison to compare this to the Soviets versus the Germans on the Eastern Front, where, vast sums of men could be thrown at the German army, but, the mountain of resources and new recruits coming in simply could not be dealt with. It's just presents something of a tidal wave. And so Hannibal is in a very similar situation where He's got the political fight at home, and he also has a limited number of resources and a limited time, like a limited window of time to maintain his hegemony over southern Italy.
All right. Well, thank you again, Terminal Philosophy.
Yeah, thanks for having me as always.
This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.